Hello, everybody. Good to see you and good to be seen. We are engaging today with one of the greatest souls that America has ever produced. We said that about Howard Thurman last week. This is a different kind of great soul. This is a poet, a person who is a focused, self-defined, and defined by her field as a poet, and one of the greatest poets that has arisen on the American landscape. Mary Oliver, during her lifetime, especially during the last 40 years of her life, was the second most read poet in America in terms of book sales, in terms of citations, etc. She was second only to Rumi. Rumi was first. And maybe if we do another great series here at Independence, we can engage with Rumi as well. I've got a chapter in the manuscript of Great Souls on Rumi, and it would be worthy of our attention and engagement. Mary Oliver is understood to be very beloved by dog lovers, by nature enthrallers, by those people who like good words that are crafted for purpose, for a focused, honed intent. And we will engage all of that during this next little time. This is not going to be a long time. I've got a lot of slides, and I think it will be incumbent upon me to get through this in a way that is not rushed, but gives you a thorough understanding of what she's about. And I'll do my best to do that expeditiously, to leave time for questions and commentary and conversation. Mary Oliver was born in 1935 in Maple Heights, Ohio. It's a kind of rural suburb of Cleveland, and grew up there. Very soon, I'll have another slide about where she lived, because where is one of the best words to emphasize when it comes to Mary Oliver. The whereness of her life, where she drew breath, where she walked, where she lay in the grass, where she looked at the clouds, where she saw geese overhead. Where is one of the most important words in her vocabulary, and she lives it out all of her life. All the way from the left to the right, these are the stages of her existence. From the left, the first two pictures there are when she lives in Provincetown, Massachusetts, on the very tip of the curlicue of Massachusetts. That's where Provincetown is. And then below, where she's holding the seashell and her dog and walking on the coast, that's down in Florida. And she moved there after many years of life living in Provincetown. She moved there in the year 2014. So the next slide kind of gives the rules of her life with regard to writing poetry. She said, I set 3 rules for herself, she said, for myself. Every poem I write must have a genuine body, must have sincere energy, and must have a spiritual purpose. And the spiritual angle of her writing was always there, nascent, if not evident. But with the publishing of a book of poems called Thirst, she began to really reveal how she was participating in the Episcopal Church. There's traces of the Episcopal liturgy in her poetry, but also the way that she talks about life and about the subject matter she writes about. She is clearly and evidently and abjectly becoming more personal and more revealing and transparent about faith issues. So the next slide is one of my favorites, and we're going to linger here a little bit because this will tell the trajectory of her journey as a human being. This idyllic little picture of fall leaves up in your upper left-hand corner is from Maple Heights, Ohio, this rural suburb of Cleveland. And this is where she was born and also abused. In an interview with Maria Shriver Schwarzenegger, she reveals much later in life that she had had good therapy and had overcome the ravages of being sexually abused. And we think she's rather circumspect about this, but she thinks it's pretty deducible that it was by her father. And one evidence that she wanted to get out of that hellish existence or connection and proximity to him was the fact that the day after she graduated from high school, she moved immediately out of Maple Heights. She would try Ohio State University, or for those of you who are part of that alumni group, the Ohio State University. She tried a little bit at Vassar, but she would end up at a little place called Steepletop in Austerlitz, New York. It's in the eastern edge of New York, across the border in Massachusetts from Stockbridge. And there she would go to venerate, to kind of adore, and also to become friends with a woman named Norma, who was the sister of Edna St. Vincent Millay, great poet. And Steepletop was Edna St. Vincent Millay's estate, and she would help Norma organize all of the collected papers of Edna St. Vincent Millay. In her first book of poems, No Voyage and Other Poems, there's kind of evidence that she pays tribute in certain ways to Edna St. Vincent Millay and is kind of using her as a model in some ways, but not completely. And that picture right beneath the Maple Heights picture is the picture of Steepletop, where she will live for about 6 years, helping to organize the papers and to assist Norma in that project. During one of the moments at Steepletop, she will meet a woman named Molly Cook Malone, and she will fall in love. And this will be the lifelong relationship that will nurture her, that will guide her, and that will keep her the rest of her days. The picture of her walking is in Provincetown, and this picture with the vegetation and the pool here is Blackwater Pond. And we'll read a portion of On Blackwater Pond later on in our session today. It's one of her most famous poems, and you'll see why in a minute. At Blackwater Pond in Provincetown, she's learning, she's writing, she is producing again and again and again. She will win many awards. She will win the Pulitzer Prize for a book called Primitive that is extraordinary. In the very first part of her life, actually, as a writer, she wins the Pulitzer Prize. She'll win the National Book Award for New and Selected Poems, Volume 1, that is also extraordinary. She'll win the Lannan Prize. She wins a Guggenheim Fellowship. Why she didn't get a MacArthur Fellowship, I have no idea, because she was a genius and she deserved that support and that kind of endorsement, as well as that recognition. The pictures here of her on a sailboat, this is of Molly and her in the sailboat, I guess off the coast of Provincetown. I don't think that's down in Florida because they did never live there together. And these are sand dunes that are from Provincetown as well. The picture in the upper right-hand corner and in the lower right-hand corner are of her years in Hobie Sound of Florida. She will move there in the year 2014 and live there until she dies in 2019. In a moment, we'll look at some of her books and you'll see that she loves dogs, and she's got a book of poems called Dog Songs. So all of you canine lovers, You can, if you're not familiar with her books, her book on dogs and her dog poems, get ready. I do want to do some, she's very quotable. Mary Oliver is one of the more quotable poets that we have extant in American literature. And at the end of one of her poems called Summer Day, which is really, really a great poem to read in its entirety, she asked this one question: tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? And this, I think, is a good question for us to ask any Sunday, any day, any season in our life, COVID or not, and to really probe the dimensions of what it would mean to really live authentically, to live honestly, transparently, fully, with joy as well. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? That might be a good thing to tape to your mirror so that you might see it in your medicine cabinet or someplace else every day. This poem called The Uses of Sorrow, this is the entire poem in its entirety. The subtitle under the title is In My Sleep I Dreamed This Poem. Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was a gift. Think about that and think on COVID times about what that might mean and what gifts are coming to us even during these days. I'm not talking about just if you're double dosed and you've gotten both vaccines and that's a gift, but I mean, if you haven't gotten any vaccinations, what have been the gifts of the last year? We're coming up, at least in our household, of marking that annual circumnavigation of the globe, or of the sun, excuse me, and seeing that a year's worth of time has gone by and it seems like a blink, but on the other hand, it seems as if it's been profoundly full. And I would implore you to think about what has been a gift in the uses of this pandemic as well during this last 12 months. So if we can go on to the next slide, Brent, we come up to her books. And where do you start? My goodness. American Primitive, excuse me, is the book that won the Pulitzer Prize. New and Selected Poems, Volume 1 is what won the National Book Award. Here's the Dog Songs poem for all you dog lovers or lovers of dog lovers. And then I wanted to highlight two books that begin to reveal and kind of flesh out the words and the contours of her faith, Evidence and Thirst. Those two books are the most readily accessible faith-tinged books of her poems. But if you want to read what one reviewer called it her spiritual autobiography, you would read Upstream. It's a collection of essays. It's got lots of wonderful stories that she tells, observations, interpretations of writers that she loves, including Emerson and Thoreau, and that to whom she's often compared to. Upstream is one of my favorite books. It goes along another book called Long Life, a book that she wrote of prose and essays, and intermingled with some poetry, but mostly prose. And then she's got two books about writing poetry, about what it means. One called The Dance, another one that I can't remember right now. But you would, if you were a writer of poetry, you would do well to read both of those books too, to not a how-to of 1, 2, 3, you're going to be a great poet like Mary Oliver, but that you would be able better to capture and to be claimed by your own voice as a poet. The book that probably is if you're only going to buy one book, I would suggest the book Devotions, which was the last book that she published before she died. And this is selections from most of all of her other collections of poetry. And they are representative and they are inclusive of all the great poems. They're all there. And that's the book Devotions. The thing that Devotions does not have are the 3 chap books that she produced when she was in Provincetown. The Night Traveler, Sleeping in the Forest, and another one whose name I can't remember. But all 3 of these books are rare. And I think The Night Traveler goes for $1,500 on the American Book Exchange. So any of you want to make that a gift to all of us Mary Oliver lovers, we'll welcome it, but we won't be expecting it anytime soon. But anyway, the Devotions book probably is the entry point into, if you're just going to buy one book, that would be probably the book to get. Although Thirst and Evidence have faith replete throughout them, as does what has been called as her spiritual autobiography, the Upstream book. So next slide. So I thought what we'd do is do a couple of poems before we see a video of her reading her own poetry. And I'm just going to read. This is real awkward to do on Zoom, but if we were in a class, I'd love to have us recite it almost like a liturgy. But I'm going to read this, and then hopefully where you are, just read it along with me. And this is her poem called Praying. And this is the entire poem. It is absolutely stunning to me. And let's listen. That's a good emphasis, as you'll see it by the end of the poem. Let's listen as we read this, as I read this. It doesn't have to be the blue iris. It could be weeds in a vacant lot or a few small stones. Just pay attention, then patch a few words together and don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest, but the doorway into thanks and a silence in which another voice may speak. I doubt if I know of a better definition for what praying is all about than that. And I suggest that you pray today or use this to focus on the doorway of prayer itself, and that you consider all aspects of your life for which you are thankful. Then put a few words together and do that for about 10 minutes, and then sit silently for at least 10 minutes as you listen for another voice. I'm just going to repeat that last definition, if you will. This isn't a contest, but the doorway into thanks and a silence in which another voice may speak. Let's have the next slide. To be very honest, death is probably on the periphery of everybody's vision these days. The threat of COVID for people that we love, the threat of COVID in the daily count, as we see 526,000 people that have died from COVID or COVID-related deaths, as we see the millions that have been infected, as we try to tamp down the rate at which people are impacted by COVID-19 as we deal with this pandemic. So this poem really doesn't deal with crisis or with urgent responses to a pandemic or a crisis-related kind of death dealing. But it does deal with mortality, which is pretty much part of our lives these days. And this poem, When Death Comes, is one of the more chastening of her poems. She's chastening herself, but if you read it and you get claimed by it, you could feel a little bit of that chastening yourself. And I think it's one of her more moralistically strident poems, but not in a bad way. And hear what is ever to be heard in this poem for you as I read it, okay? When it's over, I want to say, all my life, I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom, taking the world into my arms. When it is over, I don't want to wonder if I made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. Oh, I don't know if you can feel the chastening in that, the challenge, but I do. And so, are we living lives that are particular and real? Do we find ourselves sighing a lot? You know that commercial where they're teaching people not to be their parents, and the guy sits down and goes, ugh. And an older parent obviously is being referenced, and they said, do you hear that? I wonder if I sigh like that myself. Am I living a life in which I'm frightened? Am I full of argument? Will I just end up having visited this world? Those are questions to ask ourselves, I think. And could we become married to amazement? So I suggest a way to use this poem, be used by it in terms of your prayer life, is to confess any sighing or fright or argumentativeness that may have hindered your journey up to this point, and verbalize your request to God as to how your life can be something particular and real. So, by the way, I want to suggest that you eat a piece of fruit that way, particular and real. Find a good peach, a really good ripe peach. Eat it by yourself over the sink, right? So that you can taste it, its succulence, and savor it fully, deeply. And so that you won't just you will not have just visited the peach. You will have engaged with the peach. That could be a prayer. That could be a prayer. Here's her reading, and before.
This is a poem called The Fish. The first fish I ever caught would not lie down quiet in the pail, but flailed and sucked at the burning amazement of the air and died in the slow pouring off of rainbows. Later, I opened his body and separated the flesh from the bones and ate him. Now the sea is in me, I am the fish glitters in me, we are risen, tangled together, certain to fall back to the sea. Out of pain and more pain, we feed this feverish plot. We are nourished by the mystery. I'm tied. George Eliot and her husband, really, George Lewis, used to refer to some of the material goods that they have by the names of books. They would take out their new set of dishes and say, these are the Silas Marner dishes, or the Mill on the Floss curtains. And we have at least a few cups and saucers that are the wild geese cups and saucers in our household. So this is wild geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things.
I wanted you to hear her voice. I'm not sure if the poetry lovers among us would agree with me, but I'm going to make a kind of a blanket statement that poets are not usually the best readers of their own work. Amanda Gorman and, Maya Angelou notwithstanding, one of the worst, or two of the worst readers of their own poems were T.S. Eliot and Robert Frost. They're almost unbearable in terms of listening to them, to my ear. Maybe it's my ear. Maybe you find them great, but they're not cadenced. They're not real. They're stiff. They're kind of cardboardish. And I think you heard in Mary Oliver somebody who's a real human being and has wonderful elocution and can convey the words on the paper that she has written and printed her poems in such a way that they jump off, that they become alive. Amanda Gorman at the inauguration was a premier example of this. So that we can see it, she says, and then she says, and then we can be it. A beautiful, beautiful, dramatic elocution of the meaning of her beautiful words. Not all poets can do that, but Mary Oliver, I think, did in that little clip that we have. And you can find her on YouTube reading at the 92nd Street Y in New York, interviewed by Maria Shriver Schwarzenegger. You can see her at various poetry readings. They're not innumerable, but there are enough to give you a really good sense of what her voice sounds like and what she was like. Full of play, full of humor, and I think that you would enjoy that. This is in Blackwater Woods. I remember I cited that picture from where she lived along the road, and this is Blackwater Woods. It's in Massachusetts, and it's one of her most sacred spaces. And Blackwater Woods is a longer poem, but I just excerpted this last portion, which teaches a lesson. Not all poetry is instructive. Not all poetry is meant to teach a lesson. Not all poem is full of a lesson. Poetry can just move us. Poetry can just illuminate us. Poetry can break us open like a seed. Poetry can do many things to us spiritually. But in this one, we're left with a great piece of counsel. And I put the picture of her partner, Molly, here on this page because she must have really learned this lesson well herself when she had to say goodbye to her in the year 2005 when Molly died. Molly was about 10 years older than she was. By the way, coincidentally, apparently a very good friend of Norman Mailer, very unlikely compatriot for somebody in Mary Oliver's circle, but I think that she was good friends with her there. So anyway, Molly Malone Cook was her partner in life for over 40 years. And this is a good poem about any long-standing relationship, any relationship with an institution or a long-standing connection, and certainly a deep relationship. Hear whatever you can hear, and take this in as I read this last few lines of In Blackwater Woods. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and when the time comes to let it go, to let it go. I'm going to read that again. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and when the time comes to let it go, to let it go. That's good and sage advice, I think, for all of us. So let me just do some conclusive remarks. And on the next slide, Brent. Before I get into these kind of bullet points, let me just say that Mary Oliver is known as somebody who really does convey and portray the natural world. But I don't think that she should be viewed as a nature poet. I think she's much more profound and much more important than that. She portrays the world, our place in it, our connection to this fragile blue orb upon which we live and depend, and which we need to protect, and all of its creatures. She doesn't think that this is a nice little puff thing that we're in, this earth, but the natural world in all of its beauties and wonders and brutalities from time to time. And she does this with an economy of language and descriptive power, and sometimes some breathtaking metaphors. She self-described herself as this way, that she was a praise poet, that if I have any lasting worth, she said, it will be because I've tried to make people remember what the earth is meant to look like. And she tried to do that as a praise poet. There's a line, by the way, from Annie Dillard that we're not going to go into during this series, but she's another person we could look at for a great soul. She's wonderful. And toward the end of Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, she says, and I walk through the woods and my left foot says glory and my right foot says amen. Mary Oliver is in that tradition of Annie Dillard's descriptive power of what she did in her life as well. By the way, I don't know the extent of her wealth, but she had to become pretty wealthy because of the sale of her books. And but there's another way that she was wealthy. William Sloane Coffin once said that there's two ways to be wealthy: to have one, great means, or two, have few needs. And Mary Oliver probably had a combination of both of those, but I think her needs were few. A good place to write. She also needed seclusion and privacy. She was very private, would not grant too many interviews along the way, did not like people prying into her life. Part of that probably came from the abuse that she suffered as a child. Part of it came from her being gay and wanting not to suffer through the bigotry and prejudice that so much of her life probably would have entailed, given the lack of progress in that regard over time. I think she would be delighted to see where we moved now as a country. I know she was delighted, but she was a private person, a shy person. She liked to keep to herself. But she also believed in hard work, diligence, and fine-tuned honing with regard to the words and the language. And there's an economy in her words, and there's an economy in her spirituality, I believe. She was always deepening in her growth as a human being. It's evident and clear that as her thirst was slaked along her journey, she was able to give extraordinary gifts to all of us. Just let me do this summing up in terms of what's to love about Mary Oliver and her poetry. She's accessible. One of the ways that poetry is interpreted, at least in the 20th century, last century, was that T.S. Eliot kind of wrecked poetry on the American scene. He liberated it, made it beautiful, made poems like Allen Ginsberg's Howl possible, made Jack Kerouac possible, but also ruined it because it seemed to be kind of an esoteric exercise that, oh, you have to be really deep to know what the poets are talking about because it's so dense and opaque and it's not readily accessible. Well, Mary Oliver is very accessible, not simpleton, but accessible. She's very accessible. She's not in the tradition of T.S. Eliot, but more in the tradition of Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman, both of whom she cites as influences on her. Her poems, her words, her style is beautiful. It's simple. It's very, very honest. She'll describe, as she did in that video clip of gutting a fish, by the way. That's a great poem about the oneness of what you do with a fish and how it becomes part of you and you're part of it and the kind of bond that you have with that which you're going to eat. She has a love of and in and for the world. She doesn't view the world as dirty, as sullied, as broken, and she's not Augustinian. And not that Augustine was only that way, but we have a lot to lay at his feet for making us feel dirty about sex and dirty about life and earthly existence. She had a love of and in and for the world. She had a very inclusive worldview, and she had interfaith sensibilities. She's the only poet that I'm aware of, and I'm not aware of all poets. I'm an armchair enthusiast. I'm an English major and took a lot of poetry and read a lot of poetry and try to write some poems. But I don't know all poems, but she's the only poet I know that has poems specifically about Rumi and Buddha, as well as Jesus. It is extraordinary that she has that kind of wide embrace. She's capacious. And she pays attention. This truly is, I think, her gift, is that she really takes time to take in the world, and she pays attention in ways that are profound. I want to read a poem called Musical Notation 2. It's in her book called Thirst. And it's not a great poem, but it has a power in it that I think you will see. By the way, she's a feminist of the first rank, but her words here are not inclusive. Her pronouns and references to God are not inclusive, but they're powerful nonetheless, I think. But let's note that. Everything is his. The door jamb, the wood stacked near the door, the leaves blown upon the earth, upon the path that leads to the door, the trees that are dropping their leaves, the wind that is tripping them this way and that way, the clouds that are high above them, the stars that are sleeping now behind the clouds, and simply said, all the rest. When I open the door, I am so sure all this will be there, and it is. I look around, I fill my arms with the firewood, I turn and enter his house and close his door. She's frequently full of that little surprise catch at the end, like that poem included. So I'm going to leave it there. I conclude with this beautiful picture of her with her dog. This is down in Florida in the year 2015, I believe. She died in 2019. She had moved to this place in Sarasota. Let me see if I can find the exact name of it. She moved to Plymouth Harbor, Sarasota, Florida, in the 17th of June, 2014. But she died on January 17th, 2019, in Hobie Sound, Florida, down from Fort Pierce and up from Miami, if you know your geography in Florida. And she died, and she died a peaceful death. I could not find out where she was buried or her ashes were strewn, where they were strewn. I don't know. I would suspect that that's a private matter and that has some connection with Molly Malone Cook.
Bob, this is Kay. What was Molly's background, or was she in the arts as well? I can't remember.
Yes, she was. She was a photographer.
Okay.
And there is a book, I don't have it here. It's, I had to move some stuff to storage. And the book that they wrote together is a book of her photographs, Molly's photographs, and Mary Oliver's poetry. It's a beautiful piece of literature and beautiful piece of art as well.
Do you know what it's called?
Yes, I do. And I'm going to tell you in just a minute. Our World. Yeah. Our World.
Okay, thanks.
It was published in 2007. And by the way, she had two basic publishers. She was published by Beacon and by Penguin. But Beacon published a lot of her stuff. And that was that's a good poetry, a good publishing house for her. Living in Provincetown, she could connect to editors and publicists and everything else because Beacon is in Boston.
She also has a couple of CDs that are worth, that she reads her own poetry. There's two. One's on Blackwater Pond, and I forget the other one is. And, it's hard to find, probably for the reason you said, that poets aren't always good at reading their own poetry, but sometimes I try to find them and they don't exist. But she has two. One's a double set.
I really wasn't familiar with Mary Oliver's name, even again, kind of like Howard Thurman. These are jewels, or anyway, out there that are waiting to be discovered by many people. But do you know if any of her music has any of her poetry has been set to music, like choral music? There's a lot of choral music that uses great poetry, even though it doesn't have to rhyme, so that's right. A question I have.
To my knowledge, not familiar that there are, but I will not be surprised if people are doing this because either plain song or they just surely have been inspired by it. But yes, and it lends it so well to liturgical use. Yeah, a lot of times people want to put her poetry and put pretty pictures to them, and they do this all the time. They put it on blog posts. They'll put their pretty pictures with her words because they seem to match and they have a connection with her.
Yeah.
Lots of pictures of ponds, lots of pictures of geese. And if you're a golfer, you know that geese are not completely benevolent. They have a malevolent side to them that she would recognize, by the way. Oh, let me just say something about a poet that is not even on our radar screen, but you need to know about this poet. Louise Gluck has a connection with Mary Oliver as well through Provincetown and through a guy named Stanley Kunitz. Stanley Kunitz is an extraordinarily great poet. He was a teacher of poets, I think at Columbia, and Louise Gluck won the Nobel Prize, by the way. That's, a lot of people don't know her, but she won the Nobel Prize. For God's sake, we ought to pay attention to her. She's an American, and she went to Columbia to study under a feminist poet there. And on the first week of classes, they said they were going to read no male authors at all. And she did not need that. That's not why she went to graduate school there. So she switched to come under the tutelage of Stanley Kunitz there. And Stanley Kunitz, she gave him a big stack of her poems and asked him to critique it. And so a month went by, 2 months went by, and no words. And she's fretting, not insecure, but wondering. She's a newbie, wanting to make her mark, wanting to become a good poet, but he's not responding. She must suck, right? So she finally gets around to setting up an appointment. Oh, yeah, I'm so sorry. Yeah, come on over. And so she goes over to his house, and all the poems are laid out on a dining room table, as I remember the story. And they go over to look at them. And he says to her, well, all of these are really bad, but you know that because you're a poet. So at once he critiques her quality as being inferior, not worthy, not up to snuff, but at the same time elevates her to the status of poet. Stanley Kunitz says, I'm a poet? Wow. So she tells that in her own development. I say that because Stanley Kunitz was in Provincetown. That's where he lived. And I have yet to see where Mary Oliver and Molly and Stanley Kunitz got to know each other. Sure, they must have. She published some poems there and was in charge of a literary guild kind of thing in Provincetown for a number of years. But eventually, when a super duper PhD thesis has been rendered into a readable biography, we'll be able to know that story, I hope. But read Louise Gluck. She's a great poet.
Hey, so let me show Wild Geese. I've not listened to it, so we'll see what it is. So as always, I'm deeply appreciative of Bob, kind of opening up a part of my world, which was kind of like, where was I and why did I miss this sort of way?
Let me just say one more thing before you play the clip. Don't forget that we're going to deal with Fred Craddock next month. And we don't know if it'll be on Easter Sunday or if it'll be maybe the Sunday after. We'll see. But it's coming. And I've already begun thinking about how we're going to deal with Fred. There is so much there. It's so rich. And by the way, if you don't know who Fred Craddock is, you'll be glad you did after our next session. If you do know who Fred Craddock is, you'll be so glad that you know him even more. One of the great gifts to spirituality in North America ever in America, period. But we'll see that next month.
I'm going to play a new song, and I'm using lyrics from a poem. Are you familiar with Mary Oliver?
Yes.
So, great. She's great, right? So, very much appreciating this opportunity to try new things. This is a new song, and this is her poem, Wild Geese, in case you've heard it. Okay. Meanwhile the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes. Over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination. Calls to you, calls to you, like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things.
I'll do, why don't I close with a poem? How about that? Thirst, and it's the title poem for the book called Thirst. And that's where she begins to reveal some more about the faith dimensions of her life. The ways that critics would call this would be, oh, she's becoming more confessional. I don't know if you can become more confessional than she was all of her life. She just uses different verbiage and different words. But this is called Thirst. Another morning, and I wake with thirst for the goodness I do not have. I walk out to the pond, and all the way God has given such beautiful lessons. Oh Lord, I was never a quick scholar, but sulked and hunched over my books past the hour and the bell. Grant me in your mercy a little more time. Love for the earth and love for you are having such a long conversation in my heart. Who knows what will finally happen or where I will be sent, yet already I have given a great many things away, expecting to be told to pack nothing except the prayers which, with this thirst, I am slowly learning.